In the last video, I mentioned something called the oracle bones that date back as far as the Shang dynasty in China. These oracle bones tell us something about the religious beliefs of people who lived during that time. Specifically, they tell us that the ancient Chinese people believed in ancestor worship. And so, what these oracle bones were they were questions written on a bone or a shell, and then they'd be put into the fire. And when the fire heated up the bone and it cracked, a diviner would read the cracks and interpret the answer to the question that was written on there from the ancestors. And so it appears that the earliest stages of Chinese religion that we know of, anyways, included a great deal of stress on things like ancestor worship. This method of questioning the ancestors and the gods, and the gods were probably seen, at least initially, as an extension of the ancestors. But this method of asking questions to the gods or the ancestors was codified into a tradition, and it was put down to a book called the Book of Changes, or the I Ching, and that's what it's best known as in the West, the I Ching. But that's the old Wade Giles formulation. The pinyin spelling of it is the Yi Jing. So you'll see it both ways. Okay, and the Jing part, or Ching, means book, and then Yi or Yi part means changes. So it's the Book of Changes. This is a book that dates back probably very early in the Zhou dynasty, and perhaps even earlier than that. It's a book of divination, and so what you would do is you would take 6 sticks or stalks of wheat or something, and you would carve a notch in one side so you had a front and a back, and you would throw them on the ground, and there's 6 of them. They either could be up or down, sort of like flipping a coin, right? Heads or tails. So you have 6, you have 2 different states that it could possibly be, 2 to the 6th power, 64 different possible outcomes, and then you would take the I Ching, right, or the Yi Jing, and you would look at it, and whatever the number was from 1 to 64, like for example, hexagram 13 is called lovers, beloved, friends, like-minded persons, universal brotherhood. And the text of it reads, lovers, friends in the open, success. It is advantageous to cross the great river or sea. The superior man will benefit if he does not slacken his righteous persistence. And of course, that has to be interpreted further, and that's just a little bit of what the Yi Jing says for that one hexagram. So this became popular in just sort of general Chinese thought. Now, when the dynasty shifted, Chinese ruling dynasty shifted from the Shang to the Zhou dynasty, this was a shift of tremendous importance in the development of Chinese religion. The chief god of the Shang dynasty was called Shangdi, which just means great Shang, basically. And so the Shang dynasty had a god named Shangdi, and he was supposed to be the ancestor of the ruling family, the Shang house, and he was worshipped as the king's ancestor. But because he was the ancestor of the Shang family, he always favored the Shang household, and if you were not a member of the Shang household, tough luck for you. So when the Zhou dynasty overthrew the Shang, they proclaimed that Shangdi, the god, had withdrawn his approval of the Shang dynasty because of their lack of de. This is a very important word. There are a couple of very important Chinese words that I will use throughout this talk and the one on Taoism. De, D-E, means integrity or power or virtue, right? And so the Zhou dynast said that the Shang leaders no longer had integrity or power that had been granted to them by the god to rule And so the rule had been given instead to the members of the Zhou household. Not only that, they said, the Zhou said, but the god's name was not really Shang at all, but really his name was Tian, Tian. He was, this is really the main god, and this word is sometimes translated as heaven, right? And so they began worshiping this god, Tian, who was a sky god or a power from above, right? And Tian granted the mandate to rule to an individual king or dynasty as long as they followed the Tao. And this is the second important Chinese word, Tao. And this is a word that is usually translated as the way, right? Following the right way or path. And so the path of if the rulers of China followed the path, followed the Tao correctly, they would retain the mandate of heaven. This mandate, the Chinese word for it is Qian Ming. Ming means mandate, and Qian, of course, is the word for this god, the sky god. And this phrase, Qian Ming, or mandate of heaven, became increasingly important, starting with the Zhou dynasty and lasting all the way to the end of the Chinese dynastic period in 1911. Chinese kings and rulers always claimed that they had the mandate of heaven on their side. And when one dynasty overthrew another, as happened from time to time, the rationale that was given was because Tian, God, had withdrawn his mandate. Now, I should say that Tian wasn't considered to be the only god. He was just, I guess, the most powerful god, the king of the gods, perhaps. So how did a ruler follow the Tao, follow the way that was set forth? Well, it included the performance of certain rituals, like sacrifices to the ancestors of the gods. Rulers had to do that. Moral integrity was certainly important. Decisions concerning matters of state, conduct at weddings and funerals, leadership during war, all of these factors and others came into play when the gods were considering whether to keep or withdraw the mandate of heaven from a particular ruler. And if it was withdrawn, then the dynasty would be overthrown, theoretically. Another book from this time period that I'll mention in passing is a book by Sun Tzu called The Art of War. It's not a religious text in the traditional sense. It is the application of Chinese philosophy and religious thought in the context of warfare. However, the book was often taken not to refer specifically to war or exclusively to war, but also could be applied in the inner struggles that a person goes through. And so some Confucianists or Confucians of a later period rejected the art of war because it, for example, advocates the use of deception and spies, which in Confucianism is considered to be unworthy of a ruler. It betrays a lack of integrity. However, the art of war was read and used by both ancient and modern Chinese leaders and leaders in other from other backgrounds as well. So Mao Zedong, for example, read The Art of War. Vo Nguyen Yap, North Vietnamese general, read and applied aspects of The Art of War. And after it was translated into English in the early 20th century, General Douglas MacArthur used The Art of War, and The Art of War is sometimes approved reading in corporate boardrooms in America. Okay, so that's The Art of War. During this time period, there were 5 books that came to be revered as sacred texts among Confucianists. There was the Yi Jing, which we've already talked about, or I Ching, the Book of Changes. There was something called the San Li, which was 3 texts about rituals. There was the Shi Jing, or Book of Songs. There was the Shu Jing, Book of Documents, and the Chung Chu, Spring and Autumn Annals. which is a chronological outline of events from the state of Lu. So these books reflect traditional Chinese religion out of which Confucianism and Taoism arose, but they are not, they don't advocate Confucianism explicitly because Confucianism wasn't around yet. They all predate Confucianism. So I'm going to read just one little bit from one of these books from the Great Learning, which is part of the San Li. This is from the Book of Great Learning. What the Great Learning teaches is to illustrate virtue, to love people, and to rest in the highest excellence. The point where to rest being known, the object of pursuit is then determined, and that being determined, a calm unperturbedness may be attained to. To that calmness there will succeed a tranquil repose, and that repose there will be careful deliberation, and that deliberation will be followed by the attainment of the desired end. Things have their root and their branches. Affairs have their end and their beginning. To know what is first and what is last will need near to what is taught in the Great Learning. All right, so that's just a little sample of one of the teachings from the Great Learning. Now, the name Confucianism, sort of like the name Hinduism, was not a name that was used by the followers of the religion. It was given to them by outsiders, specifically by Jesuit missionaries to China in the 16th century. They saw that these people, the people who followed this set of beliefs and practices, greatly revered a man by the name of Confucius. So they called it Confucianism, and it's still called that to this day. In China, it was traditionally referred to as the school or tradition of scholars, those who studied their exams. Remember, we talked about to serve in the Chinese government, and scholars were called Ru, and so it was a school or tradition of Ru. Confucianism became dominant in the later Zhou dynasty, towards the tail end of the Zhou dynasty, and it became the official ideology of the Chinese state and the ruling elites during the Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE. Now, Confucianism acknowledged various gods, but it didn't put a whole lot of emphasis on these gods. It focused more on this world and human responsibilities in it, including, however, the rites that were performed on behalf of the gods. There were certain rituals that you just needed to do, didn't matter why, you just did them. There wasn't a whole lot of interplay between an individual and the gods other than through these rituals. Now, Confucius himself, his dates are 551 to 479 BCE. He is almost exactly contemporaneous with the Buddha, born and died within a few years on both ends. He was born in the state of Lu, Lu, in northeastern China. His original name was Kong Chu, but he was popularly known as Kong Tzu, or Kong Fu Tzu, which means Master Kong, and from Kong Fu Tzu, people from the West heard Confucius, and that's how they wrote it down. He lived during the spring and autumn period, the tail end of the spring and autumn period. It was a time of political fragmentation and social upheaval. Confucius didn't like that. He wanted to stabilize government by injecting moral and ritual standards, supposedly based on the teaching of ancient sages. And so he left the state of Lu, and he traveled around to neighboring states looking for a ruler who was righteous, who would implement his desired reforms following the true Tao, but which had been lost, according to Confucius. But he didn't find anybody who was willing to do that, so he came back home to Lu, and he spent the remainder of his life teaching his disciples. Confucius was perhaps the first person in all history to make teaching his primary vocation. Confucius saw a man named a man called the Duke of Zhou. He was a ruler several hundred years before Confucius. Confucius saw the Duke of Zhou, who had succeeded his brother King Wu, who was the first Zhou emperor. He saw the Duke of Zhou as an ideal ruler. As I said, this is 500 years or so before Confucius' time. Because why was the Duke of Zhou an ideal ruler? Well, when his brother died, his brother the king died, he had a young son, and the son was the rightful heir, but his son was still a young child. He was too young to rule in his own right, so the Duke of Zhou stepped in and he ruled over China for many years, for several years, until his nephew, the rightful heir to the throne, came of age, and then the Duke of Zhou stepped aside and gave the King Wu's son his rightful place on the throne. And so the Duke of Zhou became sort of a patron saint of sorts for the followers of Confucius. The main source of teachings about Confucianism come from Confucius's book called the Analects of Confucius. And this is a book that was compiled by his disciples shortly after his death, although there are a few sentences, a few phrases or statements from some early Confucianist teachers besides Confucius. Primarily, the Analects are concerned with human life and social order, but Confucius believed that Tian, heaven or God, he believed in Tian, and he claimed that his teachings were based on the cosmic Tao, which made humans part of the larger order of the universe. You can compare this to the Stoic notion of the Logos, which can be translated as word or reason, and is found in the New Testament in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Every time that word appears, it's the Greek word logos, which at least in part reflects the Stoic notion of reason that ties the universe together. So the Tao in Confucian thought is similar to that. Confucius accepted the existence of God's spirits, of spirits of ancestors, but he told people, don't pay too much attention to them. Don't get caught up in their business. Their business is their own business, other than to do the proper rituals for them. So Confucianism is not a religion that puts a lot of emphasis on interacting with divine beings, although it does acknowledge it. In this sense, it's sort of like Jainism. It acknowledges the gods, but doesn't interact with them very much. Confucius, for similar reasons, refrained from discussing the nature of the afterlife. He seems to have believed in one, but he doesn't talk about it because basically it was unknowable, he thought. And he was also critical of those who left society to become recluses, similar to Sikhism, which is critical of those who leave their families to become shramanas or ascetics. And so it's interesting in the different religious traditions we've looked at, some of them emphasize the value of asceticism and living by yourself or in small communities, and others say no, family and community are more important. Confucianism is definitely part of the latter. Let me read a little bit from the Analects. The master, that's Confucius, said, "Is it not a pleasure, having learned something, to try it out at due intervals? Is it not a joy to have friends come from afar? Is it not gentlemanly not to take offense when others fail to appreciate your abilities?" Yu Tzu said, "It is rare for a man whose character is such that he is good as a son and obedient as a young man to have the inclination to transgress against his superiors. It is unheard of for one who has no such inclination to be inclined to start a rebellion. The gentleman devotes his efforts to the roots, but once the roots are established, the way, the Tao, will grow therefrom. Being good as a son and obedient as a young man is, perhaps, the root of a man's character." All right, so that's from the Analects of Confucius. The main point of Confucius's teachings was the perfection of human conduct in life, and there are two cardinal virtues, according to Confucianism: ritual and benevolence. Ritual and benevolence. The two are related because a good person who manifests benevolence, that is goodwill towards other people, is also a person who behaves perfectly in accord with ritual. He follows all the rituals that he should perform in relation to the gods. Ritual originally referred exclusively to sacrificial rites that were directed towards the gods and ancestors, but the word ritual came to include all formal duties and polite manners of everyday life, and Confucianism's references to ritual have this broader sense. So, according to Confucianism, social harmony results from each individual recognizing his or her rightful place in society and acting accordingly out of an attitude of duty and sincerity, both outwardly and inwardly. Um, the the social structures that Confucianism most emphasizes were standard to Chinese society. Confucianism is anything but a religion of revolution. It's a religion that took traditional Chinese values and codified them. So there are several traditional relationships in Chinese society. Relationship between father and son, between ruler and subject, between husband and wife, between older and younger brother, between friend and friend. And so Confucianism assumes a patriarchal structure in society and the inherent hierarchy with rulers, males, and elders above subjects, females, and youth. However, it recognizes the potential for abuse within such structures, and so Confucius teaches reciprocal responsibility. So, for example, the wife owes the husband obedience and respect. The husband owes the wife kindness and provision. There are similar mutual benefits within the other relationships. One of the central features of Confucius' teaching was commitment to government service. Public service and government vocation were considered the highest calling in society because the person was serving the entire community or the state. When Confucianism first arose, it was only one of several of the warring, or of the 100 schools of thought, and so it had to kind of compete with other ideas like the Mohists, the Mohism, who emphasized universal love, and the legalists who thought that the Confucian emphasis on benevolence was a little squishy. Legalism was really what really mattered. The two most famous proponents of Confucian thought arose during the Warring States period, and their names were Minsa and Shunsa. So, Minsa, and you sometimes see his name Latinized as Mencius, and then Shunsa. Okay. And so the sa part, the Z-I part, means master. Mingsa believed that humans are basically good, although they could do bad things if they lost their way. And so the reason that he believed this, he said, was because, look, what happens if a person walks by and he finds that a child has fallen into a well? He will always stop to help a child who's fallen into a well. Therefore, humans are basically good. Mingsa was opposed to strict regulations and harsh punishments. He thought that education was a better solution to the problem of the loss of virtue. He said there are 4 inborn virtues: benevolence, righteousness, ritual, and wisdom. All right, so that's Mingsa. In contrast, Shunsa believed that humans are basically evil, without an internal moral compass. However, they can be trained in ways of morality, and this is the purpose of Confucian education. Goodness, he said, was a product of conscious effort. He felt like Minsa's ideas were not really realistic, and the early rulers of the Han Dynasty, who were supporters of Confucianism, they agreed with Shunsa, and they adopted his interpretations of Confucianism. And in fact, Shunsa's interpretation of Confucianism continued to be accepted by majority of Confucianists, and particularly by rulers of the Chinese states who supported Confucianism, for about 1,000 years. It was only during the Tang Dynasty, starting in the year 618, that Mengsa came to be considered the more authoritative interpreter of Confucianism, and that evaluation has continued down to the present day. Most Confucianists today see Mengsa as the more correct in his interpretation of Confucianism. We've talked about the fact that Confucianism was supported, advocated, promoted by certain dynasties, the Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, and it was not promoted or even somewhat suppressed, not overtly suppressed, but other dynasties supported other religious traditions, Buddhism, for example, or Taoism. And so what happened over time, as I've said before, is that these three religious traditions sort of blended together, and the ordinary Chinese people often followed a blend of religious beliefs. And there was a common saying that goes like this: Confucianism for the external world, Buddhism and Taoism for the internal world. So there was a Confucian scholar in the 8th century by the name of Han Yu. He led a reform movement in Confucianism that advocated a return to simpler practices of writing, and also to a return to the central messages of Confucianism found on the classics, especially as advocated by and interpreted by Mengsa. He was critical to some extent of Taoism, but and also he was critical of Buddhism because he saw Buddhism as a foreign religious tradition that didn't really capture Chinese society and customs. During the Song Dynasty, starting in the year 960, there were several masters of Confucianism who likewise opposed the encroachment of Buddhist ideas, to a lesser extent Taoist ideas, but especially Buddhist ideas into China. And despite this opposition, they were still influenced by certain aspects of Buddhism and Taoism. And this gave rise to something called Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism arose during the Song Dynasty, and it took the traditional Confucian emphasis on relations and among individuals and relations with the state, but it also added metaphysical speculation about the nature of the universe and reality, which was something that had been found that was found in Buddhism and Taoism. And so with these aspects imported into Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism spread, and it led to a decline of Buddhist influence in China, at least for a while. The most famous and influential Neo-Confucianist thinker was a guy by the name of Zhu Xi. Zhu Xi, his dates are 1130 to 1200. He was a brilliant young man. When he was 18 years old, he passed the social service exam for entry into government service. Nobody ever entered government service at 18. Most people would go at 18 and take the test and would fail, and then they go back 3 years later and 3 years later and keep taking the test until they eventually passed it in their 20s or 30s. But he got in when he was 18, and he became a proponent of Neo-Confucianist thinking. He advocated a streamlined version of the Confucian canon. He said the Confucian canon, the sacred texts of Confucianism, are the Analects of Confucius, the Mengse, that is the teachings of the Confucian scholar Mengse, the Great Learning that I read for you a little while ago, and the Doctrine of the Ming. So 4 books: the Analects, Mengse, the Great Learning, and Doctrine of the Ming. Zhu Xi wrote commentaries on each of these 4 books, and for Xu Xi, the main goal of Confucianism is the individual's moral improvement and the quest to become a sage, a wise man, as opposed to the traditional Confucianist emphasis on preparation for public office. I mean, Shu Shi was in public office, so that was obviously important, but because of this inclusion of metaphysical ideas into Neo-Confucianism, this sort of changed the goal for a person's life, according to Shu Shi. One other thing I want to mention about him, Shu Shi also taught the importance of contemplation. Now, where does that come from? Well, from Buddhism, perhaps, and perhaps also from Taoism to an extent. So the idea of contemplation had not been something that had been part of traditional Confucianism, but Shu Shi said that contemplation is important because this is how you're going to become a sage, by contemplating the Tao and thinking about what it means in your life and how to carry it out. And study of the Tao, according to Shu Shi, includes both a focus on the inner world and the outer world. All right. So his interpretation of Confucianism was officially sanctioned in the Ming Dynasty, and it became the focus of civil service exams starting in the Ming Dynasty in the year 1313, actually starting before the Ming Dynasty in the year 1313. When you studied for the civil service exams and you had to study Confucianism, you specifically studied Shu Shi's interpretation of Confucianism, which built to a large extent on the teachings of Minsa. All right. So let me see. I think that's all I want to say about Confucianism. In the next video, we'll talk about Taoism.